They are the most iconic religious image in our townships for as far back as our memories care to take us. They meander through our streets, low-heeled black shoes cracking little stones, black leather bags carrying Vaseline, tissues, hope, and prayers. They never walk alone. They are a world unto themselves, a distant world, yet a world whose radiance permeates through all of our lives. They glide through our communities draped in a multitude of uniforms, and amongst all of them there's one uniform in particular that is forever etched in our collective minds. It is said that the black skirt represents the sin that we are told we are born into. The red blouse, the blood of him who bled on a cross. The white club placed squarely around the shoulders, and the white hat that is shaped like the inside of a cathedral. These, it is said, are the mark of purity that divine love brings into our lives. In their different church denominations, they go by many names. We simply call them Bomme Bathapelo, Abomama Bomthandazo. When I started with episode 1, my idea was that I was going to go back to my spiritual roots. I figured that my mother would be the best place to start asking questions and that I would move forward from there. But the more I spoke to her, the more it became clear that her views on spirituality were part of something bigger than her even. She had inherited her views from her own mother, who in turn inherited those very views from her own mother. Yet, these views had shaped my world as a child. In fact, they dictated how our society functioned. The reasons why I knew so little about African spiritual practices were entrenched in how my mother and those who came before her navigated the world. Their suspicious approach towards African beliefs were a result of something. This something went far beyond the fact that our mothers considered themselves to be Christian. Also, their identification as Abomama Bomthandazo was rooted in something that I think exceeded the boundaries of the church. To understand how Bomme Bathapelo came to be the literal moral fiber of our society, I needed to understand how this organization actually came to be. What was its purpose? How did it become so powerful? What was the social, political, and economic atmosphere at the time when it was created? And was it a tool to conquer African beliefs? And in joining these organizations, did our mothers betray our people? In order to get some perspective on this topic, I needed to speak to someone who understood the history. It had to be someone who understood the socio-political realities of black women throughout that particular period of time. It also needed to be someone who is not just a black woman, but someone who is unapologetically a Christian, because I didn't want someone who would just dismiss the particular aspect of the faith's history or to try to explain it away. So, to find this person, I did what anyone who takes their research seriously would do. I used the ancient practice of sliding into DMs. I contacted a Facebook friend of mine by the name of Zonaka Nechifulani. We made an appointment, I packed up my equipment, and I headed into Jozietown.
I need to know everything, who and the what and the where, I need everything. Trust me, I hear what you're saying, but I like it's new what you're telling me.
The reason I contacted Zonaka in particular is because she is a law researcher at the Constitutional Court of South Africa, and she's also a lay preacher in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Not only that, she's also a slayer of dragons, first of her name, the mother of many awesome unborns to come. So I couldn't go wrong.
Stay on their toes, stay in your lane, how to stay on the go. I can play with the pros and act like a rookie, so they
I wanted to sort of talk to you about is that I spoke to my mother about her beliefs, right? She told me that Bomme Bathapelo, she grew up in the church, and the reason she did that was because her mother did that. And I suppose her mother before, maybe 2 generations before. But what I understand the history, I understand, the missionary work, the mission stations when they came, and the socio-political impact that they had in societies. But what I don't understand is, what is it that drew Black women to Christianity at the time? Because there are elements of the Bible which are patriarchal, right? Deeply so. And by virtue of the fact that the time and geographic area in which the Bible was written was a deeply patriarchal culture.
Yeah.
So it was bound to reflect in the writings.
Yeah.
The politics of the time also still come through.
Yeah.
So I don't understand what is it that drew women, Black women in particular, into it at that time. I'm sort of trying to go back in time and say, it's what, 1890, there's a mission station that has been opened. What is it that is drawing Black women to it? In your understanding of it, what do you think was happening to women at the time that felt like they had found a home? Because I can't believe that it was just the word of God or it was Jesus. I think there was, because it would be difficult for Black women in 1890 to relate to a middle-aged white man from Europe who's talking about a God and a promise and a world that is totally unfamiliar to them. And the rewards of which he can't necessarily show them, because he's coming alone. He can't say you will end up in a big house, so to say. This is one man living in a mission house, so can you sort of try to take us back to that time in your understanding?
I think so. One of the things that we've been trying to figure out today in 2020 as people who are curious about the roots of Christianity and our belief systems is trying to recognize that the Bible, while sort of a pure, let's use the word pure document without intent or malice, it's just a recordal of God's plan of salvation, whereas that is a very sacred and largely untouchable book. The way in which the faith was brought to wherever it was brought to, anywhere in the world, was not without motive, was not without intent, and was not without forethought or foresight or planning. So the missionary that came here wasn't simply saying, Shem, who don't know anything at all about this wonderful man called Jesus, let me just bring them into the faith. That was not necessarily the concern. I think there were ideas and beliefs that colonialists, imperialists needed to pass on to their new subjects. And one of the ways of making that happen was by introducing this new world framework with Jesus at the top and the white man just underneath him, and then Black people and everybody else, below. So I think one of the main reasons was definitely to create the society of the colonialists or the imperialists' dream. So, and I say that to say that when the faith was then brought to Africa or to Africa's shores, it was done in a very systematic fashion. Well, I would hope it was systematic. I find colonialists rather stupid on most days, but I think that they arrive on shore, they decide that this is the type of society we need to do, but there are people who believe certain things where we found them, and they believe either in their ancestors, they believe in or whomever or however they explain where mankind comes from. But this sort of deity is getting in the way of us getting what we need from them. And they create all of these things and they create the society. One of the things that they do is that they remove things like bartering as an economic system, and now tender is coin. You need to find a way to get coin, right? If you want to live in your house and not get it, raised down by the governor of the province, you need to pay a hut tax. Where you're going to find money for the hut tax, you're going to find it by working in the mines. So now you've taken a father out of that space, which means you've taken a protector and a guide and, somebody who was able to be there for the family. You've now created this new economic system where women are now dependent on these coins that these men bring back from the mines. The women now stay behind and must find a way to survive, or they follow their husbands to the city and they themselves start making livings in various ways. So you now have this, and at the exact same time, the faith is being taught. And then you say, well, in order for your children to be able to survive in this society, they should be educated in the white man's ways, or whatever it is. And then you say, well, how are we going to educate them? Well, lucky you, Father Brown has a school not 500 meters away from the village. So you send your child to the school. And who runs the school? Father Brown. And what is taught at the school? Jesus. What is shown at the school? Jesus. So it's not necessarily an idea where women woke up one, and I would love to say that it is, because the gospel is beautiful. But it's not necessarily an idea where women wake up one morning just filled with the Holy Spirit and just madly in love with the Godhead, and they decide, of their own volition, with complete and total freedom and agency, to enter into this faith and into this belief system. It's a realization that without the hospitals that are run by the church, without the clinics that are run by the church, without the schools that are run by the church, without the medicine and the social aid that is brought by the church, I will not survive. My children will not survive. This church comes with education. This church teaches people how to read. This church gives people access to better opportunities. If my child successfully gets through Sacred Heart, they could go to Fort Hare and become a teacher, or a nurse, or a police officer. And it all starts at Father Brown's school, 500 meters away from the village. And attached to Father Brown's school, there's a church. And then over time, then you start melding the beauty of the gospel together with the practical benefits.
Because increasingly more and more men are leaving.
Yes.
And more women are having to stay. Because from my understanding as well, that what in the early days, a lot of people who were sort of attracted to the church or ended up in the mission houses were also outcasts.
Yeah.
Like women who her husband died and she didn't want to marry their brother. Or, men who couldn't make proper means in the village, and then they ended up there. So it gave a certain level of refuge
and social security. Yes. Yeah, okay. So I think that's part of the reason. I'm not saying that there aren't women who were not sincere believers, who didn't sit in the pews every Sunday and find a very wonderful logic to the story of salvation and to the story of redemption. Those women might be there. But I think when you're preaching it the way that you're preaching it, and you're preaching it as a person who's at the top of the social food chain to people who are currently at the very bottom of the food chain, you're introducing a power dynamic into the relationship that makes us question whether or not it was divine intervention and a feeling that God is real, or whether there's an idea that if I don't somehow start believing in Jesus, I'm going to starve to death.
Sure. That's actually a very profound thing to say, because it's almost like they sacrificed themselves into an unknown,
exactly,
for the sake of the family, because then they were the only link for their family to anything, because the men were gone and some were not even coming back.
But I also think if you just look at your life, you believed. You believed in your faith, you believed in your ancestors as your guides, you believed in whatever or whomever you believed, and your cattle still died, and your land was still stolen, and your husband was still sent away. And here's this person who is preaching this God to you, and they're doing great. They're doing fine. Their families are healthy. Their wives wear beautiful clothes. Their children always look neat and tidy. So there might actually be a point behind what this person is saying. Because surely if what I believe was so amazing and so phenomenal, I wouldn't be suffering the way that I'm suffering. So maybe this Jesus guy is the reason why these people are so powerful and the reason why they came out of nowhere and all our cattle are gone. All our land is gone. We're somehow paying a high tax. We now use cash. So maybe this God is more powerful. Maybe we should follow him. Maybe there's a practical reason behind that. And I think that's the more toxic aspect of that. When you merge the faith together with that kind of violence and that level of oppression, you then give the idea and the impression that your God is the one that was behind it, and without him you wouldn't be where you are. So now the people or the masses that you're now meeting are saying, hi, mhlawumbe. They have a point.
The conversation that I had with Zonaka was quite a long one, and I'm hoping to be able to share more of it in future episodes. But what she shared in this segment is actually very significant, and it needs to be unpacked thoroughly in order to understand why this particular period was so formative in the creation of women's manyano. To begin with, there are many factors that led black women to not only join the Christian church, but to create women's manyano in the first place. And many of these do not actually revolve around the church, nor are they contained in the Bible. The period from around the mid-1800s right up until the mid-1900s was an extremely tumultuous time for black people. Many laws, policies, and ordinances had been passed in order to dispossess black people of their land. But not only that, black people needed to be turned into tools, machinery, that would enrich those who oppressed them. The hat tax that Zonaka spoke of was one of the most instrumental tools that the colonialists used in order to achieve their objectives. The hat tax was a type of taxation introduced by British colonialists in some parts of Africa. The colonial powers felt that the natives needed to pay for the expenses related to being ruled by the British Empire. This tax was levied specifically on African men on a per hut basis. This meant that many black people had to essentially pay rent to live in the very homes that they had lived in for generations before. Also, the hut tax necessarily coincided with the discovery of gold in the Transvaal in 1886. There was a ferocious need for manpower to work in the mines. The labor force needed to be abundant and it needed to be very, very cheap. The tax forced black people into the capitalist system in a way that would lead them to be perpetually disadvantaged by it. For one thing, the laws that were enacted prohibited black people from trading livestock or fresh produce in order to pay the tax. It had to be paid in cash. The men who were not able to pay this tax were forced to either work in the mines or on white farms in order to pay off their debt. Nonetheless, there were not enough black men who were being convicted and sentenced to the mines in order to meet the needs of the mine owners. So the hut tax regulation was revised. This was also levied on every male over the age of 21, and it essentially meant that black men had to pay tax in order to exist. Then there was the squatters tax, which was imposed also on every adult male who basically didn't have a place to stay. Then there was the dog tax. Yes, a tax for owning dogs. Sporty, Bobby, no danger also had to pay tax. The taxation laws worked in tandem with policies that legalized the dispossession of black people's land. These policies were passed over a long period of time with increasingly dire consequences for African people. For one thing, the Native Land Act of 1913 declared that only 7% of the land in this country could be occupied by Africans. The Native Trust and Land Act of 1936 increased this amount to 13%. All these policies were enforced with a brutal military violence that involved a weaponry that African people could not match. These laws left the majority of black people with no other means to generate an income but for the men to go to the mines. But the effects of colonialism were not all that black people had to contend with in this period. There were also natural disasters that happened simultaneously with the ravages of colonial oppression that left black people quite devastated. In 1953, a Dutch ship docked in the harbor of Mossel Bay. This ship was carrying a shipment of cows, Friesland bulls, and these cows were infected with a disease called lung sickness. This sparked an epidemic that broke out around the Natal and Cape Colony. One of the effects of this disease was that cows would start rotting from the inside. This disease led to widespread killing of cows as many black farmers tried to contain the spread of the disease. In Xhosa communities, the disease had such an intense and paradigm-shifting cultural impact on the psyche of the people that there emerged narratives such as the story of Unwangqawuse, whose apparent prophecies led to what came to be called the Xhosa cattle killing movement. In 1918, 2 ships arrived in Cape Town in September, carrying members of the South African Native Labour contingent. These were black men who were conscripted into the army to fight for British interests in World War I. These soldiers brought back with them a type of influenza called Spanish flu. This disease had killed more than 5 million people worldwide at the time. These men returned to their communities and their families, and by the end of 1918 alone, 127,000 black people had died from infection. During that same period, maize plantations were laid waste by a species of insect that attacked the roots and destroyed the stalks before the corn could ripen. The Cape Colony itself experienced a locust infestation that decimated crops. Then there was a hailstorm that crippled much of the production of produce in that same area. As a result of those colonial and natural factors, the migrant labor system was born, and many men left their homes for the mines. At some point in Natal, as many as 80% of the men worked in the mines in the Transvaal. Many women were left behind. In the pursuit of helping white farmers to enrich themselves, the government began to sell farmers maize as feed for their livestock at subsidized prices. The government incurred a big loss for this, and to make up for this loss, they started to sell maize to black communities at inflated prices. The money that the men in the mines were making was specifically designed that it would never be enough for any family. The hospitals that Zonaka spoke of, they were filled with black women watching their children starve to death. The level and scale of devastation that black women were witnessing was something that nothing in their collective memory had ever prepared them for. By black women, I am talking about your great-grandmother. I am talking about your grandmother. Most of these occurrences do not take place all at once. Many of them happened decades apart and in different areas, but they all occurred within a time frame where a woman could witness most of them in one lifetime. So, with her husband and her brothers and her sons far away inside the stomach of the gold mines, as her family's livestock lay dying, with her crops in ruins, with other members of her family succumbing to disease, with more and more of the land that she has called home for generations being stripped away from her, with her children slowly being devoured by starvation, in the midst of all this that she was witnessing, a church appeared. The approach of missionaries in African communities was at first to position themselves as a peaceful friend. Let's call them Father Brown. Father Brown would approach a local chief and humbly request a small piece of land upon which he could set up his station, his church. The fact that he was one man who carried no weapons made him seem relatively harmless, and many were given the land that they requested. The notion that missionaries brought religion with the barrel of a gun is not entirely true. The truth is, however, far more deceptive. In his humble request for land, Father Brown brought with him the proverbial Bible, and instead of a gun, he brought a bale of cotton. The cotton was essentially the commercial component of the colonial missionary strategy. The merging of commerce and religion was crucial to how colonial powers would eventually subdue the native people. The bale of cotton brought with it European standards of culture, morality, and a strong sense of superiority. You'll see why. In the words of Dr. John Phillip, the superintendent of the London Missionary Society, who was sent out to the Cape in 1819, he said, I quote, "While our missionaries are everywhere scattering the seeds of civilization, they are extending the British interests, British influences, and the British Empire. Wherever the missionary places his standard among the native tribe, their prejudices against the colonial government give way. Their dependence upon the colony is increased by the creation of artificial wants." Close quote. Many of the missionaries brought with them traders who opened trading posts in local communities. These were essentially spaza shops of the time. As more and more black people were unable to farm for their staple meals such as maize due to land dispossession, it was the missionaries who sold these products to them. As Dr. Phillips saw it, the missionary was necessary in generating a demand for consumer goods while, at the same time, creating conditions which facilitated the establishment of commercial opportunities for white settlers. As the people lost more and more of their land, ironically, Father Brown's missionary land was increasing exponentially in size. It can be said that the success of the missionaries in southern Africa appears to have been hinged upon their ability to provide viable agricultural land for the black people. But to access this resource, there was a price to pay. A black person had to renounce their cultural identity and embrace the church and its teachings, all in exchange for refuge. For one thing, it was declared that no member of the church was allowed to go anywhere where there was slaughtering of animals for departed spirits. This was based on a belief that, as one missionary stated in describing their understanding of African ceremonies, they are bottomless superstitions, they are vile habits, and they are heathen customs. They are incessant beer drinking, and they are heathen dances which are attended by unspeakable abominations. These present a terrible barrier to the spread of Christianity and civilization. Close quote. This basically meant that the moment a black person set foot on the church grounds, they had, by extension, turned away from their communities, their families, and their ancestors. They were now outcasts, traitors. The most famous and long-lasting legacy of the missionaries is probably the missionary schools. Within black communities, attendance of missionary schools had created a new social dynamic and hierarchy. Being educated, or at the very least being literate, was associated with the religious view of somehow being holy. This was because the reason the missionaries taught black people how to read was so that they could read the Bible and spread the word of God. Being literate also meant that you embraced Western worldviews and that the powers that be treated you with a little less brutality. Most missionary schools focused on teaching domestic science, home nursing, childcare, as well as general education to female learners. Boys, in turn, were taught gardening, handcraft, and woodwork. It was ironic that the missionaries believed that black women were incapable of taking care of their families or clothing them or taking care of their homes unless the white people taught them to. Over time, however, the ratio of men to women in the church began to change. The cultural shift that the church had brought and the socio-economics of the time meant that there were more women than men in the church pews. It is against this backdrop that in 1907, the Methodist Women's Prayer and Service Union, commonly known as Women's Mañano, was created. all other similar women's organizations in different churches were modeled against the one that the Methodist Church had created. Manyano was essentially created as a black version of another women's organization within the Methodist Church, the Women's Auxiliary, which was for white women. A separate entity had to be created for black women because racial segregation at the time meant that black and white women were prohibited from engaging at any level beyond that of master and slave. At that particular period, the Methodist Church was populated by the British, who were far better off than even the Afrikaners financially. That meant that the scope of the work that the Women's Auxiliary focused on essentially translated into the women sitting around and drinking tea, sharing scriptures and baking recipes. Black women, on the other hand, had bigger problems. Women's Manyano was created, amongst other reasons, as a prayer group that came together to pray for the men who were at the mines. Many of these men were dying there. It was also to pray against the natural devastations that the black people were facing at the time and to try to provide some level of service towards the communities. The church essentially gave black women the framework of achieving their objectives in a way that would not lead them to be victimized by the government. A part of the functioning of the mission churches that helped to give rise to Women's Manyano was the encouraging of women in local communities to meet on a weekly basis. During these meetings, educational classes were given to adult women such as sewing and general housekeeping. In fact, in time, sewing came to have a fundamental role in how missionary work infiltrated the gender psyche of black society. Adoption of Western clothing came to signify commitment to Western religious views. Many missionaries measured the success of their work in different communities based on the extent to which black people were wearing Western clothing. Since women were now in charge of clothing the community, they were also, by extension, entrusted with the community's Christian virtues by dress and by behavior. In line with this philosophy, young African girls were seen as future spouses of Christian men, mothers of Christian children, and makers of Christian homes. In fact, there grew such a strong focus on young girls in the church that at the 1912 Transvaal Methodist Manyano Convention, the discussion centered around the care of girls who, quote, fell into evil ways, close quote. The European cultural view was that sexuality in relation to girls was something that carried with it a sense of shame, both in expression and in form. Female sexuality was, in a sense, a gateway to eternal damnation. On the other hand, in African cultural beliefs, sexuality as it related to young girls was something that was celebrated. There were in those societies rites of passage and social mechanisms through which older women guided girls through the different stages of womanhood. In the African view, girls would not only grow to become wives and bearers of children, they would also grow to be keepers of knowledge and history. In the absence of formal schooling, it was actually women who were the primary teachers of their children. In African cultures, there were systems of learning that taught girls how to acquire, preserve, and wield knowledge that guided entire communities for generations. As a result, the religious gender framework that had penetrated black communities through the church had caused a rift in how mothers related to their daughters. It is at this point that views on how girls should dress according to European cultural norms were introduced. Along with this, there was also the perpetuation of this notion that girls were responsible for infecting the minds of boys with lust and they were responsible for leading boys astray. All these foreign worldviews were intertwined with biblical teachings to give European opinions on life a divine quality and a moral superiority. Interestingly, in some missionary schools, it was discovered that many girls were taking to academic work than they were to handcrafts. Some white leaders of the church instructed Manyano chapters to exalt the virtues of wifehood to their daughters and to try to dissuade them from academic pursuit by implying that domestic work was essentially divine service. Every time I think about my grandmother, my mother's mother, I always have this image of her in my head where she's sitting under the apricot tree in her yard. It was a few meters away from the kitchen door. You would always find her sitting in the shade of that tree, and in front of her she would have a Singer sewing machine. It was a sleek and black machine, and it was built into a small wooden table. Underneath the table would be a small pedal that you would push in order to make the machine come to life. I remember always watching her work, and it was always so mesmerizing how she worked the machine, how she made the fabric just glide through. My mother's favorite memory that she likes sharing with me is when she was young, and a few weeks before Christmas, my grandmother would come with all sorts of patterned fabrics, and she would let all her children choose a pattern, and then she would get to work making all of them a Christmas outfit. Looking back and knowing what I know now, I realized that the exercise of teaching my grandmother how to sew was intended to merge her maternal instinct with a European worldview in order to weave Christianity into the very fiber of her being. My grandmother stitched my mother's memories of her childhood together along the lines of what the church approved, and only what the church approved. Black women have been making clothes for their families for thousands of years. But most of these women didn't learn to sew amidst the devastation and the brutality that my grandmother and her mother had to go through. They didn't learn how to sew as a process of trying to save their children's souls from eternal damnation. My mother didn't become Abomama Bomthandazo by virtue of the teachings of the church. She was taken by the virtues of her mother's grace and how she carried herself. It was the hem of her mother's garment that she was trying to emulate. George Macheke once said that mother is God to the child. My grandmother found immeasurable strength in her Christian faith. But then again, I don't remember her calling herself a Christian, but she always called herself Abomama Bomthandazo. Thank you very much for joining me on this episode, and please stay tuned for part 2 on this focus on Abomama Bomthandazo. My name is Vosumzi Nqande, and this is the Journey Kwantu. I wish you courage, and I wish you all the very best on your journey. Makwande.